Hello, I'm Xaq Frohlich, and this is our class on mad cow and other food scares. In this second part of the class, we're shifting from a discussion about ethics and ethical eating to a more general discussion about what it is we consider to be edible, what makes something a food, what things make us uncomfortable with certain things that are edible, and so forth. So in today's class, we're focusing on food scares and in particular meat, the mad cow crisis in Britain, and then also looking at what happens when things go global in the Korean beef protests in 2008 and then the horse meat scandal more recently in Europe. So in the introductory class I listed a series of food scandals, 3 in particular that I said were important for why food has become important to us today as an intellectual topic, as a cultural topic, and also as a policy topic. And the first of those scares was the mad cow in the early 1990s. As I said, for each of these scares, they raised slightly different interests for us as policymakers about why the public was concerned. So in the most recent of these scares, the obesity epidemic, the concern has been about a change in nutrition and whether we need to modify or change our traditional ideas about food and health. The genetically modified food debates have been about globalization in particular, but also anxieties about Americanization or McDonaldization. But today we're going to talk about the mad cow debate, which is, as a food scare, in particular a debate about how the public can gain or lose trust in its public institutions and regulatory institutions. And also, how does one build risk management around scientific uncertainty, in this case prions. And out of the mad cow debate became a growing interest in my field in also studying the communication of risk and engaging the public in these sorts of debates. But before we move into the mad cow debate, I wanted to talk about more generally what is meat and how has our idea of meat changed in modern times and with modern production. So what I'd like you to do right now is pause the video and write your answer to what is meat. It seems like a simple question, but in the comments below, I'd be interested to see how you would try to attempt to define what makes something meat. Okay, so meat is actually something that we use to talk about a wide variety of things. Traditionally, meat was actually broader than just an edible substance of animal origin, which is the veterinary definition of meat. In the past, in medieval times in Europe, meat and a similar word, mead, were used to describe the core of one's diet. And so the earlier Old English words for meat also may have been broader and referred to other things such as wheat-based core diet concerns. But increasingly it was used to refer to butcher's meat. In modern times it can talk about cold cuts, poultry. We distinguish between game meat, where you hunt for it, versus domestic or grown meat. And then you have, as this picture shows here, pink slime, which was a scandal several years ago where people became concerned about this highly processed meat substance. So all of these things get put together under the term meat, and clearly they're all very different and they're all produced in very different ways. So I want to draw attention to this because when you're talking about meat, if you talk about cuts of an animal, the production process is very different. If you're talking about a highly produced pink slime, again, what contributes to creating that substance, that edible substance, is very different. And so concerns about risk and safety change. They also show the ways that with changes in production, our ideas about what is a food substance and what is meat can evolve. Now, language is also important beyond just defining what is meat, but also in thinking about the ways that we distinguish meat from the animal. And in this sense, particularly in English, language does work. So you will notice, for those of you who are either non-native languages and had to learn English, or those of you who are English natives, that we often use a different word for the animal, pig, cow, or sheep, than the word that we use for the meat substance that comes from it, pork, beef, and mutton. Anthropologist Edmund Leach wrote about this and argued in the 1960s that this reflects a kind of mental effort to separate the violence of against animals, the abuse against animals, from the function or eating of them. And many people today talk about how language, in addition to the production methods, works to help us not think about where our meat comes from. And why is this? Is there something about the slaughtering of animals that we find disturbing or even disgusting? And is that something universal? This is a kind of interesting anthropological question, an interesting historical question. Here you can see a quote for Sir Thomas More's Utopia in the 16th century, where, and I'll read this, where he says, "But there are special places outside the town where all blood and dirt were first washed off in running water. The slaughtering of livestock and cleaning of carcasses is done by slaves. They don't let ordinary people get used to cutting animals because they think it tends to destroy one's natural feeling of humanity. It is also forbidden to bring anything dirty or unhygienic inside the town for fear of polluting the atmosphere and so causing disease." This passage is interesting for several reasons. Let us recall, Utopia is describing the perfect town, and yet here, even in the perfect town, Sir Thomas More has to address this imperfect or unsettling thing that the town depends upon. And so what is the solution? The town moves it to the peripheries. Just outside of the perfect town, there is this dark, ominous, disturbing place. What makes it dark and disturbing? Well, in part, it's this violent act. And so they have to give it to people who lose their humanity, slaughtering these animals, in this case, slaves. And so there's also a kind of suspicion about the people who do the killing of the animals. The other thing that makes it dark and dirty is that it is literally dirty and potentially unhygienic. And so it is a potential threat to the cleanliness and the purity of this perfect place. Now, I always like to point out to my students when talking about utopia that the roots of the word utopia has a kind of double meaning that is interesting and important to understanding it. The U can mean no, and topia, place, and so therefore utopia means no place in existence, or the U can mean perfect, and topia, place. So we tend to use utopia to talk about perfect place, but Sir Thomas More is very strategically suggesting there is no such thing as this perfect place. And in this passage we can see this fundamental anxiety that surrounds the creation of meat and slaughter. But is this universal? When I talk with my students, one thing I ask them is, do any of them know a butcher? Or do any of them know someone who works in animal production? Because it is certainly true across cultures and historically, people kill animals, and you can get accustomed to this. It can be part of your everyday practices and not seen to be so disturbing as it is here in Sir Thomas More's Utopia. Now, in the modern times, one reason why people have been so disturbed about this is because of urbanization. Just as Utopia is describing a town, and outside the town you move the disturbing, disgusting things, as cities grew larger, the act of killing animals became even more disturbing because it was of scale. And the modern contemporary debates about meat production can be traced in the United States to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and the pure food movement at the late 19th century. So in 1906, Upton Sinclair, this journalist, publishes a book, The Jungle, where he describes the Chicago stockyards and these big, gigantic, massive slaughtering houses. And what motivated him at the time was a concern about labor. These big industrial places were also places where people, mostly immigrants, worked. So in the story he describes how an immigrant comes to America and gets pulled into this dark, dangerous world that happens at the heart of Chicago. So it's also about this urban place. Now, at the same time, in preceding this book, there was a lot of interest in whether industrial foods were contaminating and whether this urbanization was contaminating food production. And so a food chemist, Harvey Wiley, who was at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, was promoting this idea that we need modern scientific methods for assessing the quality and purity of food. So in Upton Sinclair's book, he talks about this issue, about the chemicals that are used that potentially deceive consumers. But for Upton Sinclair, it was not a central feature of the book. This is a journalistic coverage of the story of an immigrant in this industrial practice. Now, ironically, the book is published. There's already interest in pure food movement. And immediately after, there is a push for legislation, which becomes the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And one of the reasons why Upton Sinclair's book is widely discussed is because it has seen to be the generator of this new legislation. But the legislation itself doesn't focus on labor conditions. Instead, it focuses on contagion. Contagion, the concern around the new germ theories and the ideas that foods can carry pathogens, also contamination and adulteration, and this idea that we need to have strict laws and standards on food. And Upton Sinclair famously says, sadly, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." And this is a feature of a lot of food regulation. Historically, many journalists will come and talk about problems in the conditions of food production, and the public seems to focus on how it affects them, the consumer, in questions of food safety and food security. But the Chicago Stockyard is interesting as this new place. And in Upton Sinclair's book, he gives these rich passages where he talks about the Chicago Stockyard as this new kind of environment. In one passage, when the protagonist, the immigrant, is first arriving to Chicago, they notice the perplexing changes in the atmosphere a full hour before they reach the city. And it's clear that this aesthetic is unhealthy and problematic. Colors of things became dingier, and the grass seemed to grow less green. Now, some of this is literary, some of this is to evoke this kind of disturbing, unnatural urban space. That you can see this in older literature, such as Dickens, when he describes Coketown in Hard Times. But some of this is a kind of critique of this industrial new urban space that is at the core of Upton Sinclair's book in this fictional place he describes as Packingtown. And he therefore in Packington describes the great packing machine ground on remorselessly without thinking of green fields. And the men and women and children who were part of it never saw anything green, not even a flower. Then the party became aware of another strange thing. This too, like the odor, was a thing elemental. It was a sound made up of 1,000 little sounds. You scarcely noticed it at first. It sunk into your consciousness, a vague disturbance, a trouble. It was like the murmuring of bees in the spring, the whisperings of the forest. It suggested endless activity, the rumblings of a world in motion. It was only by an effort that one could realize that it was made by animals, that it was the distant lowing of 10,000 cattle, the distant grunt of 10,000 swine. So this image is powerful. He's trying to say that he uses these metaphors that are familiar, these natural metaphors, to describe something that is very unfamiliar and disturbing. And he also is trying to paint a picture of a new kind of scale. Thousands of cattle, thousands of swine, these new sounds, these new smells, these new colors as a result of this completely unnatural man-built environment. It sounds really disturbing, but incredibly, this was a big tourist attraction. It was open for tours. Most people visiting Chicago said it was a must-see if you were going to Chicago. You had to see this new thing, and people enjoyed this, and it was part of this culture of technological sublime. They would look out into these huge packing yards, and they would say, this is incredible, the amount of coordination, the amount of scale, the vastness of it. And they were disturbed by it, but it had this kind of tourist aspect to it. Think about this today. Today, it is very difficult to see how animals are slaughtered. It is very difficult to get into the stockyards or slaughterhouses. There's culture around, there are journalist gag laws that require that people who take videos of these places could potentially be jailed. In the early 20th century, people would go to the Chicago Stockyards as a kind of tourist attraction. And it was an incredible scale. Chicago was called the Great Bovine City of the World, and if you look at this image, this map of America, it reflects what William Cronon has described as nature's metropolis. All the wealth and resources of the United States that would get shipped by railroads to the city and at these stockyards and these food processing places in Chicago would be reconstituted into food products and into consumable goods that would make up these urban spaces and be shipped then east to other urban spaces. And this is from a catalog from the 1920 pamphlet by Armour called Armours Selection from the Best Sources of Food. And there's this kind of imperial image, but also pastoral image of the United States where all of its land is turned into these kinds of potential products for Armour's food. Here's another image of the places where the cattle were kept before they were slaughtered. And this gives you a sense, looking off into the horizon, of the vast scale of it. Railroads from all across the United States, and including some cattle drives, would bring them into Chicago. And they would be kept here until they're ready to be slaughtered and turned into meat. And quoting William Cronon, visitors knew that something special, something never before seen in history of the world, was taking place on the south side of the city. This is something unprecedented. And meat had to be disassembled from the cow. And this was a highly complicated technological process that was also very new. And so in the disassembly line, you would have long lines of workers, and at each step, they would do one thing to transform the cow into a meat substance and then transport the meat substance into packaged meat that could then be shipped out. And this process was even the inspiration for later Ford's assembly line. So it was not a low-tech thing. The organizational techniques here were quite new and quite sophisticated. They had special ways of doing this. In Cincinnati, what was sometimes called Porkopolis because of its pigs, it took 35 seconds to disassemble a hog. 35 seconds per hog. Okay, so these are changes happening at the production side. On the one hand, they reflect dramatic, impressive coordination and technological organization. On the other hand, people are disturbed by the scale. They're generating new kinds of environmental waste. Here, on the other hand, you can see this from the consumption side. And this is from Roger Horowitz's book, Putting Meat on the American Table. He has a graph of what it is that Americans are eating over the course of the 20th century. And the two lines you'll notice are changes in beef and changes in chicken. So starting after World War II, suddenly beef sales rise. And you can see on this chart the first McDonald's restaurant opening up. And similarly with chicken, there's this slow, steady growth in chicken. And you might ask, why? What has changed that makes the beef and the chicken rise? And Horowitz and others show that if you change the way a food product is sold, you can create a new market. You can dramatically change the consumptions for these food supplies. And so the first McDonald's suddenly creates a market, and fast food in general creates a market for ground beef. Before World War II, most beef was eaten in cuts from a cow. Suddenly, after World War II, there's a rising market for ground beef for hamburger patties. Same with chicken. First Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise opens, and slowly over the course of the 1960s and 70s, because of this, fried chicken becomes important. There are two other things that are important to the story of chicken, which is that before World War II, most people ate chicken whole. Increasingly, in the second half of the 20th century, chicken starts to get repackaged and marketed in parts. And so that also makes it easier for people to consume and incorporate chicken into more daily diets. In the 1980s, chicken starts to get marketed as a healthy alternative to the less healthy meats of pork and beef. And so this is why you can see it shoot up right when beef starts to fall. Lessons to learn from this. If you have a new package, you have a new market, you can have a dramatic impact on the food supply. One of the best books that looks at this is Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation from 2002, where Eric Schlosser talks about, just like Upton Sinclair, conditions of the workers. He talks about the marketing revolution that happens around McDonald's. And one of the things he says is that the scale of these food providers has dramatic consequences for farming. When McDonald's decides to include tomato in its hamburger, suddenly the tomato supply is reconfigured because McDonald's or Taco Bell might become the largest purchaser of this. Now, I am teaching in Korea, and in the Korean context, a great example is with chimek. Chimek is Korean for chi, short for chicken, from the English chicken, and mek is beer. And chimek today is one of the most popular Korean meals. It's really common for students to go out and have chimek. College students have chimek. It's also common at baseball games. And before 1980s, chimek did not exist. Chimek is an introduced fast food from the United States, but now it has become this quintessentially Korean thing. And chicken was in Korean diets, but not to the extent of today. So with this new kind of marketing and packaging of chicken fries, and beer, suddenly the sales of chicken, potatoes, and beer in Korea have grown substantially. So, to wrap up, as I said, the question about food scares and meat, I think, is important to first start with the question of what is meat, and how has what is meat changed. When you have these changes in productions of meat, scaling up, when you have changes in how it's packaged and sold, a kind of marketing change, and how it's represented in the public, this changes the way we think about how we want to eat it, and also what we expect from it in terms of safety. And in a moment, I'll explain why it also has dramatic changes in questions about food safety and handling food scares.